It was the mid to late 1920s when many would say that Columbia Records was at its best, and who can blame them? Under the new management of Louis Sterling, the label had been progressing quite well cosmetically, replacing their colorfully charming yet expensive to produce flag label design with a simpler, sleek black and gold based writing, donning in on a block series of catalog numbers ending with the D suffix instead of an A. Sterling had also been responsible for the shifting of the label to the Western Electric Recording Technology, or Viotonal as they called it, now rivaling Victor in the new field of electrically recorded clarity. With these new advancements, the desire for much livelier bands came along. Those and other recording artists, including names such as Ford and Glenn, Paul Ash, Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, Ruth Etting, Cliff Edwards, Leah Reisman, and of course Paul Whiteman himself, among countless others. They too enjoyed a win by absorbing OK Records during this time. It also became clear that electrical recording was the way of the future, and because of its success, acoustical recording took the sidelines. Some of the success Columbia had led to them opening another 3 budget labels in 1925, Diva, Harmony, and Velvetone, all of which featuring mostly if not all acoustical recordings in their early years, of artists that weren't featured on the regular label, and a bunch of other pseudo-bands. These 3 are famous among collectors and are commonly brought up today. It's because of all of these things and more, you can see why Columbia was so great, and their records from that time nearly 100 years later are still enjoyed to this day. It was really the peak of the label as a whole. It wouldn't fare too well through the Depression and eventually merging into the ARC, and years of dormancy later being revived by the CBS and so on and so forth. Though, in all of that time, one Columbia label has been forgotten by most everyone today. This label has caught my eye, this being another budget label, Clarion Records, and I find that its story is important. Because there were many great record labels in the 78 RPM era, some of which being the famous game changers that affect how music is today, while many others tried in vain and failed quickly, falling into obscurity. Some labels had artists that helped create and define new genres and standards for music, while others were around just to provide music, entertainment, and advertise for a greater company, all of which having their own notable achievements whether known or unknown, that I believe all collectors and music lovers alike should know about. So, to start the story, we're first going to have to travel forward a little bit, going into the early 30s, the earliest of the 30s actually, in the predictable placement of New York City. Despite how many believe that the Depression that started in the autumn of '29 immediately opened the floodgates of poverty upon the United States, crippling every last part of the major industries, accounts conflict wildly as to the truth of this, at least in the record industry. On one hand, you had the large amounts of dime store and budget labels scrambling to reorganize and survive under their new merger, the American Record Corporation, while on the other hand you had Victor, which had taken a noticeable hit, though were still pumping out a solid stream of releases. But then you also had Edison, which no longer existed. Columbia, in terms of just the main label itself, had taken a bit of a punch in terms of releases, though its quality, and OK's as well as 3 budget labels, which were no longer exclusively acoustical, helped make up the releases and sales. The man in charge of these budget labels is the vice president and talent scout named Ted Collins. He had been for at least a few years now. Whoever's decision it was to create a new budget label is unclear. There had been attempts in the years prior to start a new one, those resulting in Pure Tone and Ward's Trailblazer, both of which have been unsuccessful. Though, sometime in the summer, it was decided that there would be a new one, and it was to be called Clarion, and Collins was to manage it just like the other 3. Clarion itself was by no means an original name and recording. The earliest Clarion was a cylinder label from 1907, which later turned to a rather colorful 78 releases up until 1920. Another made by Hawthorne from the late 1900s that got its own Columbia roots, yet another brief Cardinal subsidiary from 1920 to early 1921, none of which related to one another. Though as for this one, the naming probably wasn't inspired by the decades-old Hawthorne Columbia label, but more likely from the aspiring radio producer of the same name. They didn't just produce small tabletop radios, but also radiophono consoles, though nothing's known for sure. Just like the other three budget labels of Velvetone, Dima, and Harmony, Clarion would be another 35-cent label. When it came time to actually announce and release the label, it would be August. The label had one category number series, one being the 5000 series, ending with the suffix of C. Since the label was much newer than the trio of others, Columbia didn't bother to integrate it with the release numbering system as the others used, though Clarion's release material would be sourced from the same place that the others were. Columbia and Okeh's recording that, for various reasons, it didn't want it on its main labels, as well as re-releases from those other budget labels from multiple years back. The first release on the label was in typical budget dime store label fashion, pseudonymous, being 5001, the way I feel today, with Lou Gold under pseudonym of Rex King and his Sovereigns, coupled with Dancing with Tears in My Eyes, with Jack Alvin under the common pseudonym of Hotel Pennsylvania Music. The label would have one basic design throughout the entire runtime, that being a soft grassy green background contrasting with the gold border and text. True to its name, right above the spelled out name of the label lies a herald blowing into a long straight trumpet. Then the usual formatting of title, band, song, etc. and info applies. Though on the west side of the label, just next to the pressing ring, is another notable feature that not many notice, the electrical process labeling which, when featured, would have a chance of appearing on the same font in the base Columbia label, an occurrence sometimes seen across multiple dime store labels, though other times it would be displayed as electrically recorded, just like on Velvetone. It also had simple sleeves that accompanied it, with little effort put into them, just featuring the name and two displays of a herald on each side, though on one variant, the label slogan, All That the Name Implies, is featured, also with a bit more detail put into it. In totality, this label design was very similar to a Sears and Roebuck label named Challenge, not only in colors but in theme. Perhaps that's where they might have drawn their inspiration from. Predictably, a fair portion of the Clarion releases would be under pseudonyms like the aforementioned ones, just like the other labels. So the usual studio singers and groups by Ben Selvern, Franklin Bauer, Fred Hall, Vernon Dalhart, and the California Ramblers were a must. Other artists of note included Annette Hanshaw, Gene Autry, the Holcomb Trio, the Four Aces, Boyd Center, Rudy Valley, Eddie Young as Mountaineers, the Carson Robinson Trio, and others would appear regularly either new or under re-release. Of course, Collins would make sure that his own special discovery, Kate Smith, would be moved up on there as well. But perhaps the most interesting part about the release would be the wide range of much older acoustic recordings offered on the 5000 series. This is stuff going all the way back to the mid-1900s releases and up through 1925. Prince's Band, Frank C. Stanley, Henry Burr, the Criterion Quartet, Elliott Shaw, Arthur Collins, and more. Christmas carols, novelties, pops, hymns, marches, and other such things. Clearly this is some sort of surplus on Columbia's part, but the reasons why to re-release this now is unknown. Clarion initially had little to no advertising and not too much attention shown to it in general. When you already have three labels that's been doing its job for the last 5 years, advertising it seems kinda pointless. Clarion records, just like the others, were intended to be bought in bulk mostly by distributors and various nickel and dime, as well as dollar stores and department stores respectively. Selling at 14 cents wholesale and 4 cents would be paid in royalties for song usage by Columbia. In trade magazines, no known reviews of releases by any of the smaller Columbia labels were made, and the possibility of coverage in their catalogs is also slim. The only advertising at all was sparse, by different department stores in various areas around the East Coast and Midwest. No ads by Columbia appeared as well, so we can't accurately gauge when a record was released, unless someone had the Columbia discography book they'd like to share. Though if we take Columbia's common method of waiting 2 months to release a record after recording, which happened on the main label, and apply it to the releases on Clarion, we may get semi-accurate results for a portion of releases. As the Depression started to really settle in, Columbia would start to have a noticeably slower amount of recording sessions. It seemed that the majority of what was being recorded now would start to be primarily released on the main label. So, as with these lesser labels, OK material would start to be prominently featured over Clarion, as well as material would start to drift away from Diva and Harmony releases for Clarion and closer towards Velvetone, meaning that it would be a regular occurrence for releases to be only elsewhere available across Velvetone as opposed to the complete trio of other labels. Though it should be noted that a fair number of Clarion releases at this point and before were exclusive to Clarion. It also appears that it was around this time that Ted Collins decided that Clarion should have its price dropped to 25 cents. Soon the others would join in price dropping if it weren't immediately. One thing that helped advertise them is that Clarion releases started being broadcasted over the radio, in the various record programs featured over different times over the radio stations. Several releases about this time seemed to also attract minor attention. In the Maryland area, two specifically would be print-worthy enough, one of those being True Blue Bill by Gene Autry, and the other being Duckfoot Sue by Sherman and Lee. Other artists that started to get on the label that year included Phil Danberg, Ed Kirkaby's Orchestra, Emil Velasco, Uncle Bud's Plowboys, Bob Miller under pseudonym of Stukely, Ellington, Fred Rich Bands, one of Eddie Lang's groups, Joe Venuti's Blue Four, Frankie Marvin, of course Dick Robertson, and a host of others, and a lot of pseudonyms also. 1931 seemed to be one of the most productive years for the label, as more records were released on it than any other year in its existence. An additional reason why it was the most productive year was because on its anniversary month of the first year thriving, the label would open a new series block, one being the children's series at 9000C, which seemed to have exclusive releases of children's artists such as Tom Lee and Jack Hill. The series clearly didn't last long, as it seems not even 10 records were ever produced here. The second being the 11000 series, opening at basically the same time. This one being known as the Double Track series, as noted on the label. This one's a bit puzzling. These could be considered puzzle records, as they have two different groovings embossed onto the shellac on each side. Clarion wasn't exclusive to this though, as Velvetone also had some of these on their own. This 11000 series didn't seem to last long either, but fast forward a few more months and yet a third series also opened up, this being the 11500, which was the Extra Play series, which, unlike the series before having 2 tracks per side, instead this was one continuous recording about 5 minutes in length. This also wasn't exclusive to Clarion, as Velvetone and Harmony also got these, tailored to their own specific category block. Just like the other two, this one didn't last long either, offering music by Ben Selvin, Charles Dornberger, and the Bar Harbor Society Orchestra. The reasoning for both the Double Track and Extra Play series might have been simply responses by Columbia to Victor's experimentation with commercial long-playing records that fall. And just like Victor's experimentation, these wouldn't last long either, though they make for interesting records regardless and probably held up a lot better than Victor's. As the worsening decline of the American economy came to its zenith point in 1932, Columbia, Dime Store, and otherwise affiliated labels with it were going into the year hurting. Starting in January, the U.S. branch of Columbia was sold off to the Grigsby Grunow Company, the people who made Majestic radios, refrigerators, and other furniture and otherwise, but they had little to no experience with records. It was in their hands now. Even though record sales were an all-time low, it was clear that after the end of 1931 that Victor was the overall victor of the industry, Brunswick not being far behind. Columbia had abandoned every other series except for one of their popular discs and barely hanging on to a country and western series and slightly using the race series. Diva wouldn't survive 1931. Dates vary for when, but releases stopped appearing in the early months of 32. Whatever advances Columbia was trying to make to compete with Victor's own failing commercial long-play records would be abandoned in the early months of that year as well. Consequently, all budget labels including Clarion would lose their long-playing series in the early months, So Clarion was just back to the 5000 series. Only a few artists were released on Clarion during this year apart from the ones already, those being Gid Tanner under the name Jackson Pavy's Cornshuckers, Bob Fatso Howard, Radio Boy's Reese and Dunn, of all things Billy Cotton's band, Paul Speck, King Nawahi's Hawaiian, exactly one side of the Boswell sisters, and on the other side that same record being Crosby. Less records were being produced on the label, mostly being dubbings from Harmony, Velvetone, and Columbia now, the latest songs being from March. Columbia was falling quick, so Ted Collins wasn't about to stick around to the bitter end. So Collins in early April decided to resign as vice president of Columbia, in the process also declaring that the remaining parts of the 25-cent line was to be discontinued on May 15th, though records from it still sold into July. The last record made on Clarion was The Tree That Stands By the Road and Home on the Range by the Carson Robinson Trio as release 4577. In the end, apart from By Default with the short-lived children's series, and perhaps some of the items on the Extra Play series, a good amount on the main 5000 series were exclusively released, those including It's You I Adore by Lou Gold and the Orchestra 510C, Louise Dear by Ed Kirkby and the Orchestra 542C, My Virginia Home by Arthur Fields 564C and 5239C, and Red River Valley by the Carson Robinson Trio 5109C and 5243C, though most everything else is more commonly on the other labels. After the official statement, it seemed that not another word was spoken of Clarion by Columbia for a number of years, and so Columbia's Clarion faded into obscurity just as all the other Clarions did before it. As we all know, Columbia did make it through the Depression, and emerged out of the decade victorious, and would later regain its position of prominence in the industry, but now part of the Columbia Broadcasting System. The 40s would bring about the end of the Budget and Dime Store label era. Clarion became obscure very quickly, and even to first-generation discographers, it was considered a rarity to find one. Of the acoustical releases, Brian Russ would later state in 1984 that
if anyone needed to hear how good an acoustic recording could be, there could be no better model than Clarion.
The trio of Harmony, Velvetone, and Diva are well known to this day, as said prior, though Clarion's near 500 releases, including their same material, isn't as well known, not helped by the fact that there were so many other labels by the same name before and since. Some of those who learn about it remark about how easy it can be confused with Challenge too. From the variety of Clarion records that appear today, it's almost always the 5000 series that come up. When the 11000 and 11500 series come up, it's rare time, and they generally sell for more than much else, usually in the $15 to $30 price range online, whereas most Clarion stuff sells for about $1 to $10 usually. Predictably, high prices will also be found for Duke Ellington and Annette Hanshaw records as well, perhaps Kate Smith too. None of the artists you could really say had much of an influence directly from Clarion, though it sure got their material out there. For some releases, in a way only Clarion could. As far as I could find, Ted Collins never said anything about the label in his later years, which isn't surprising, considering knowledge of him even running the other 3 labels isn't known much about at all. But in the end, I think the label's obscurity is understandable. Though, as you can clearly see, its story is still one that should be told. It was created in a time where it was questionable whether it would be a good idea or not, and through the agonizing decline of the industry, it still stubbornly persisted for 2 years and even had a bit of uniquity the others didn't have. So, if you ever do see one out in the wild, it may do some good to pick it up and give it a try. And if there's one in your collection, maybe it's time for another listen.
I held you, you gave me all. Your love dreams I shattered beyond recall. Now that I've lost you, please understand, I'm here forever at your command. I realize now that I lost a prize. Tell me, how can I live this way? Foolish conceit, at my heart it would beat, and to think that my heart would obey. I want you, I need you, more than you know. I'll worship your love, dear, wherever you go. Once more to have you, love would be grand. To live forever at your command.